Hey all, and welcome back to another tutorial video. Today I'm working on a number of details for the layout. Firstly the fascia, then lighting, followed by a base layer of foam so that it will be ready for landforming, and finally I'll be adding curtains to help drive the focus towards the main area of the layout. Being a fully modular layout, this will present a few challenges that I'll work through along the way. Starting with the fascia. I'm using 4.8mm hardboard for its moisture resistance and durability. I didn't catch it on camera, but I measure the exact size of the desired width of the fascia before cutting, allowing there to be adequate overhang both on the top fascia and lower fascia. Cutting is made easy with a table saw, however a circular saw would work just fine. To create the cutaway for the control panel, I used a jigsaw. I did draw lines on the hardboard, however being a dark colour they are a little hard to see while cutting. So to help guide the jigsaw, some masking tape was used to make the path more obvious. The cut doesn't need to be perfect because I'll be using a piece of decorative trim around the opening later to make it look a little bit nicer. I test fit the pieces as I go to make sure I haven't made any major mistakes. Because it's modular, there will always be gaps in the fascia. I do my best to hide the gaps. One by planning to paint the fascia black, but I also try to be as accurate as possible to help minimize the amount of visible gap. These blocks are cut to the same height as the baseboard that the track sits on. That way I can clamp them onto the fascia and simply place it in position, knowing it will be at the perfect height and meet up perfectly with each adjoining fascia. Even though the hardboard is moisture resistant, it's still necessary to seal it. Any sealing paint should be fine. I prefer water-based for easier cleanup. Just make sure it gets a good even coat on the front, back, and especially the sides. Next is a base coat of black. This is going to be the final colour, however this is just the first layer as it will require a final coat of black paint later after the base layer of scenery is applied. Just like the white, it's applied on the front and sides. The back isn't necessary as it won't be visible. While that's drying, I can start on the lights. The lights are attached to the top. Originally there was a piece of plywood across the front edge. I decided to remove it as it wasn't needed, plus it would help create an opening for the wiring. I used LED strip lights to illuminate the layout. I used 50% warm white and 50% cool white to get a colour temperature that I liked. They all get mounted to 3mm MDF that has a white layer on top of it. Having the white helps bounce the light back onto the layout, making it brighter. I started with 3 lines of warm white and 3 lines of cool white, evenly spaced across the MDF that was cut to span the width between each module. The LED strips have an adhesive backing, which doesn't always work, so I also use some hot glue for a bit of added security. You'll also probably need to lightly sand the white side of the MDF so the hot glue sticks to it as well. A line of hot glue every 10 cm or so should be more than enough to hold the light strip. I also use the hot glue to help hold the copper wire that I'm using to solder the circuit together. It's not really necessary and it looks a little bit ugly in the end, but it makes soldering all the small wires so much easier. Plus it's not a visible part of the layout, so as long as nobody gets under and looks up at the lights, it will be just fine. I solder all the negative wires on one end and all the positive wires on the other. This makes it much easier to organise the wires. A major plus to having a modular layout is being able to turn the whole thing upside down to work on wiring. And the same is true for the lighting. Each light panel is positioned onto the module section and holes are drilled and the panel is screwed down. I don't use glue here because if I need to fix or change the light panel, I can easily unscrew it and do the repairs. To power the lights, I'm using a 16V 25A max variable power supply. These power supplies aren't cheap, but they are very handy, especially for lights to be able to adjust the brightness. Overall, it looked okay, but when I placed some rolling stock on each section of the track, I quickly realized there wasn't enough light at the front. To fix this, I angled the lights down using a wooden wedge that angles down towards the front. I also added an extra strip of very bright cool white LEDs to the front edge. I think this helps give a more natural sunlight colour and helps light the very front edge of the layout much better. The wiring for the lights is almost identical to the track bus wiring described in the previous video, except each light panel includes a plug so that it's easier to connect and disconnect if needed. Now with the panels installed, the lighting can be tested. There is one glaring risk though. This is overpowering the LEDs, causing them to burn out. Given the power supply can supply over 16 volts, I need to guard against this. This was simply done using some styrene. A piece is attached to the turning knob that rotates. Using a bit of superglue, the piece of styrene conveniently fits into the small notch in the rotating knob. With the knob attached, I turn the unit back on and set the voltage. I actually used a multimeter to be exact with the voltage and set it to be a value just a little under 12 volts, which is the max for the LEDs I'm using. Then a small piece of styrene is used as a stopper and glued so the turning knob can't be rotated past it. The top of each module has a small amount of play. This will need to be fixed before attaching the top fascia. Just like the lower sections of the module, it's aligned and clamped. Then a hole is drilled through both supports for the adjoining modules, and a bolt and wing nut is used. All those gaps in the top need to be filled in. So to do this, some 30mm polystyrene is used. I used white, like mentioned before. It helps bounce the light back so the inside of the layout stays nice and bright. It's easy enough to cut by placing the polystyrene on top and using a marker to trace the shape that I'll need to cut out. I rough cut using a sharp hobby knife, and then for the fine cut I'm using my DIY hot wire foam cutter. I've got a YouTube video showing how to make your own. It's great for odd shapes and precise cuts with right angles. I give the foam a test fit, and it fits nice and snug. This process is repeated for all the openings. Even though they are a snug fit, I still use some foam glue to permanently hold them in position. Most glues should be okay, but using a proper foam glue is probably your best bet for success. Plus, some glues may not be compatible with foam. Now we can finish installing the fascia. Before gluing and nailing, I fit each board up with a clamp, just to make sure it still fits okay. Plus, it will help to keep everything aligned as I start working along and gluing them down. Some wood glue is used and spread along any area of the fascia in contact with the main module. Once on, it's clamped, and then for added measure I use a staple gun to drive a few staples in as well. Once this is done and the glue is dry, it won't be going anywhere. With the staples down, I sand the front lightly to remove the raised bump left behind by the staple gun. Then some putty is applied to fill in the small hole where the staple is. Once that's dry, it will be sanded completely flat, and when painted you won't even see that there are staples. These steps are repeated right across the top, and then repeated again across the bottom sections of fascia as well, using those blocks to ensure everything lines up perfectly. Now for the gaps between the tracks. This is filled in with extruded polystyrene. It's a much more dense foam and makes for a good structural base layer ready for scenery. I put some spaces across the back so I'll have a gap in the foam for the backdrop. Similar to the top foam pieces, the lower foam is placed in position, and to help hold it down, some weights are added so that it doesn't move. Then from underneath the layout I trace around the plywood base. It's a little challenging to get under there. Having a long pencil helps. You could even attach the pencil to a stick if that helps. Now we just need to cut out the shapes. I tried 3 different methods. First was the hot wire foam factory knife and sled. The sled is great for getting the perfect angle, which was a perfect 90-degree angle for this piece. The main downside is the foam is really dense and the hot knife is kinda slow. It works great, but you'll need patience. Once cut, you can see how accurate it is, and how nice and clean the cut is with very little mess. The second method was a hobby knife, which was great but only really for straight cuts. This would be terrible for curves, but nevertheless for a straight piece it worked fine. Again, you can see it gives a very nice clean cut with no mess. The best method for me was a small bandsaw. This was fast and accurate, plus it can do curves with ease. The main downside is the dust. Small foam particles go everywhere, so it would be wise to wear a mask and be prepared to spend some time cleaning up. Plus, the edge isn't as sharp and clean, but for what I'm doing, that's not a problem. Once it's all cut, I test fit just to make sure it fits well. If it's a little bit tight, the extruded polystyrene foam sands quite easily. To bring the foam up to the level of the baseboard, I had to cut some foam spacers. These were cut on the bandsaw so that the top of the main layer of foam would be flush with the top of the baseboard. The spacer strips are glued to the module frame with some super tack glue. This is good for a quick tack, so we can put these down and then move on to gluing the main layer of foam. For the main layer, I use Gorilla Glue. This is great when gluing two non-porous surfaces together. Only a small bead is needed across each strip. With the glue applied, the foam is pressed down on top, pressing it firmly down into the glue. Sections with two pieces that join, I make sure to put some glue on the sides that will press together. Because this glue expands, be sure to weigh the foam down so that it doesn't lift or move. Excess glue can be wiped away with a paper towel and some isopropyl alcohol. The edges between joining modules are squared off using the cuts between the tracks as a guide. I start by lightly dragging the knife, gradually working down into the foam to get a good even cut. Now each subsequent piece of foam is cut so that it fits snug up against the previous layer of foam. Just make sure you don't glue those two together, otherwise the modules won't pull apart. There will be a line between the two modules, but that line will disappear later with some clever scenery items. Now with the last piece down, I don't have to worry about trains derailing and falling to the floor. Next are the curtains. I chose black so that it would match the control panel. I'm no expert when it comes to sewing, so I'm not even going to try and tell you how to do it. This was literally my first time sewing, and I'm sure I make all the mistakes. Luckily it's black, so hopefully they won't be too obvious. To mount the curtains, I use some eyelets. These come in a little kit and are super easy to apply. Now all I need to do is add the hook, and then I can hang the curtains. It makes quite a difference having the curtains. The decorative trim I mentioned earlier is a piece of laser cut acrylic. I added some magnets so the trim simply snaps up against the screws that hold the control panel onto the module. Now it's also safe to finally remove the paper from the control panel. So now you can see it in all its glory. I designed it so the switches are recessed just enough not to poke out past the acrylic trim. That way hopefully nobody will bump the switches and possibly break them. And that's it for this video. Quite a lot got done and it made some really big changes. Next time I'll be looking at adding the backdrop and also making the layout dustproof, which is going to be quite the challenge if I can pull it off. If you want to help support the channel, you might consider becoming a patron. I have a great community over on Patron, and over the next few months this project progresses, I'll be spending more time there posting updates and talking to you to see what you'd like to see in future videos for this layout build series. And for the $7 patrons, you also get access to my members only area of the website, where I have a collection of backdrops that can be printed for your model railroad, and you'll also have access to download items from my store as part of the patron reward. Don't forget, you can also post in the members area. You can post photos, plans, ideas, questions, or whatever. I'll be checking it more regularly, so feel free to start a conversation with me over there as well. Until next time, cheers and thanks for watching.